Hey guys, alright, today we are going to be watching the Falklands MiniWars #1 by OverSimplified. Yeah, I mean 7 minutes on the Falkland War, or well, I guess just the Falklands in general. I'm guessing it's not going to be about that conflict, or well, it's not going to entirely be about the conflict between the Argentinians and the British in the 80s. Right? It was the 1980s. That was when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister, I believe. Because I think, yeah, she was prime minister when Reagan was president. Look at that context. But 7 minutes on the Falklands alone. It's a lot of time for OverSimplified, at least when this video was made. Because I think he spent 6 minutes on Hitler's first 18 years or first 20 some years of life. So yeah, 7 minutes on some tiny islands. I love it. Let's get watching.
Hi, English mariner John Strong. Hi, Anthony Carey, 5th Viscount of Falkland. I would very much like for you to go to Chile and locate the wreck of a Spanish treasure ship for me. Okay.
What?
Hey, I found some islands.
That would be the English way of
The
colonizing.
English were probably not the first to discover the Falklands, but they were the first to write it down. They found it to be cold, wet, and miserable, just like home. So they established a colony in 1765.
You know what? That makes sense. Oh, this was in 1765, so they weren't English anymore. They were British. They were fully British.
Unaware that the French had also discovered the islands and done the same a year earlier. And for a while, the two were unaware of each other's existence until presumably there was an awkward moment where they ran into each other. Then the Spanish showed up and told the French that a couple hundred years earlier, the Pope drew a line on a map and said all of this belongs to Portugal and all of this belongs to Spain, and that the island was in Spain's territory and they would like the French to hand over their settlement. Now, since the two were good friends and Spain was willing to pay in cash money, the French obliged. But since they were still a little bitter about the recent 7 Years' War thing, they made sure to warn the Spanish not to let those dirty English on the other side of the island take over. So Spain went over to the English and explained, Pope, line on map, Spain's island. And the English said, yeah, right, this is our island. But the Spanish had more guns, so they kicked them off anyway. But then England threatened to go to war.
Another thing, at this time, I don't think England/Great Britain, because the union between England and Scotland happened in... Was that 1708? No. There was a formal union that happened in the early 1700s, I believe, was the time frame for Scotland and England. And then they formed Great Britain. But at this time, Britain was pretty much completely Protestant Anglican at this time. So they did not give a... They probably didn't give a shit about what the Pope said. So, you know, the whole idea about the Pope drawing some line on the map, probably didn't care too much for it.
So Spain went to their friends in France and said, hey, it looks like stuff is about to go down. You in on this? And the French Minister of War said, yeah, and we'll launch a full-scale invasion of England and party like it's 1066. But then King Louis XV said, 1, you're insane, and 2, you're fired. Sorry, Spain, we're not ready for a war right now. So Spain had to give the English their settlement back, saying it's still our island, and the English said, no, it's our island. Then some colonists in North America got a bit rowdy, so the English had to leave their settlement to go focus on that. But they left behind a plaque that said this is totally still our island. So the island was in Spanish hands, but then a French guy, no, not that one, that one.
You know, I wonder how Napoleon Dynamite would have worked as a 19th century emperor. I wonder how good he would have done. I think he would have been great.
Turned on the Spanish, took over most of the country, and captured King Ferdinand VII. And in response, the Spanish colonies in South America started vying for independence. So Spain had a little bit on its hands and also had to leave the islands. And for a couple decades, the islands were left uninhabited except for the penguins, some fishermen, and the gauchos, which are basically like cowboys, but cooler and Spanisher. A merchant from
Spanisher.
Hamburg, living in the now independent United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, heard about the feral cattle roaming the Falklands and thought it would be a good way to make some money. So he got permission from both Buenos Aires and the British government to set up trade there as a private venture. Some American ships came down and began hunting whales and seals around the islands, and Verney wasn't too happy about it. So he asked Buenos Aires for some military assistance in defending the islands, but Buenos Aires said, meh, do it yourself, gave him some weapons, and appointed him governor of the islands. So he seized the US ships and arrested their crews. In response, two things happened. First, America came down and said, nice settlement you have there. Would be a shame if someone destroyed it. And then they destroyed it.
That's a pretty American thing to do. I can concede.
Second, Britain heard Verney had been appointed governor, meaning the United Provinces, actually now the Argentine Confederation, were officially claiming the islands as theirs. So Britain showed up and said, hey, didn't you see our plaque? And since they had more guns, they kicked them off the island. And the Falklands remained firmly in British hands for the next century. They officially became a crown colony in 1840. Port Stanley became the island's capital in 1845. The cattle hides from the island weren't worth much, so they imported sheep from Britain in 1851. 2 world wars came and went, and all this time the Argentinians never rescinded their claim over the islands. Now it's 1976, and after a couple civil wars...
Oh, yeah, we're in the Falkland Wars. All right.
New brutal military dictatorship sponsored by the U.S. fight against communism has taken control in Argentina. And by 1981, this guy was in power. The economy had been struggling for a long time, and Galtieri had been unable to improve the situation. Now, if you ever find yourself the brutal military leader of a struggling South American country and you start getting into hot water, here's a bit of advice that has been tried and tested throughout the centuries.
Go to war.
Start a war to distract...
Yeah! See, I know my stuff. I know how to be a dictator. Wait, what? Maybe that's not something I should admit.
Everyone from their misery. Galtieri knew how popular he would be if he could finally take back Argentina's last Malvinas from the occupying British.
They will. It isn't just that they'll go to war. They'll also. I mean, it isn't just dictators do this. A lot of, democratic countries, just countries. Like everyone in general throughout history does this, is they either start a war to distract everyone, and also kind of war. Well, modern war can fuel economy now. It used to not be that way, especially if the war is fought on your homeland, then it certainly is not good for the economy. But if it's a foreign war and you can get there reasonably cheap, like America has been doing for the last 50 years, you can make war a very profitable venture.
There had been proposals to cut British military spending, and the ice patrol vessel HMS Endurance had been withdrawn from the area. So the Argentinians assumed the British may not even bother doing anything about the invasion. After easily capturing the largely uninhabited South Georgia island, 600 Argentine troops were sent to the Falklands. The small number of Royal Marines and other British forces stationed there put up a small amount of resistance, but in the end had to surrender to the larger Argentine force. Crowds in Argentina celebrated the news, but they were wrong to assume the British would do nothing, because the person in charge of the United Kingdom at the time was this lady. Thatcher was a somewhat controversial prime minister, but whether you
somewhat controversial? I don't know about that.
Loved her or
I'd say she was. Well, I guess then again, this is my modern perspective being put into it, because I most certainly was not alive when she was prime minister. So I would not have heard anything on the news. But. So maybe my modern perspective is making her be more controversial than she actually was for the time, but I'm not. I don't know. I feel like she was fairly controversial.
Hated her. There was no denying that she was tough, like metal. Iron, for example. She immediately declared an exclusion zone around the islands and organized for a task force of over 100 ships to set sail for the Falklands. The United Nations expressed concern at the Argentine invasion. All South American nations apart from Chile backed Argentina. And since the United States had propped up the Argentine dictatorship, Reagan went to Thatcher and said, could you maybe just let them have the islands? And Thatcher said no. Okay, here, have some weapons.
Wait, what did the U.S. weapons say?
Okay, here, have some...
For literally anyone... Yeah.
Weapons. Fighting a war over 8,000 miles from home was a logistical challenge for the British. They requisitioned civilian cruise ships and containers, and they used British-owned Ascension Island as a forward base. By the time they arrived at the Falklands in May, the Argentine forces had had time to entrench themselves. The first task for the British was to gain control of the seas, which they did easily. On the 2nd of May, a British submarine sank an Argentine cruiser. The sinking was controversial, as it occurred outside the British exclusion zone. It was also the largest loss of life in a single incident during the war. And in response, the Argentine Navy withdrew from the islands. The next task for the British was to gain air superiority. While the Argentine Air Force controlled the skies, they were able to inflict considerable damage on the Royal Navy below. Days after the sinking of the General Belgrano, 2 Argentine super-étendards carried out a raid on the HMS Sheffield and sank it with an Exocet missile. For weeks, the Argentine Air Force would continue to carry out raids and inflict heavy casualties on the Royal Navy, with British Sea Harriers doing their best to take out as many of the Argentine aircraft as they could. While the battle in the skies raged on, San Carlos was chosen as the best landing site.
God, for one, the Falklands is rarely talked about, or when it's talked about, when you're going through history, at least at the high school level, because none of my university level classes have ever talked about the Falklands, mainly because that's never in the time period that we are studying. The Falklands are very brushed over. They're like, oh yeah, the Argentinians captured the Falkland Islands. Britain got mad and sent a huge ass fleet down there, and then Britain gained control of the islands back. You're never told that there was actual like intense fighting for the islands.
For the British ground forces. An SAS raid took out Argentine defenses on Pebble Island, and the HMS Alacrity sailed through Falkland Sound to flush out any Argentine supply ships. The landings began on May 21st, with Argentine aircraft carrying out full-scale raids on the task force ships taking part in the landing, damaging several and sinking a few, but anti-aircraft cannons and Sea Harriers shot down many of the aircraft in what became a major turning point for air superiority, and a beachhead was successfully formed. Then the ground troops began their movements out of San Carlos, across the north towards Stanley, and south toward the Argentine stronghold at Goose Green. In the following battles, a clear trend emerged. The Argentine conscripts put up a good fight, and with the rough, muddy terrain, the war was by no means easy for the British, but with highly skilled Royal Marine commanders and parachute regiment troops, the British would often find themselves taking on larger numbers of Argentinian soldiers, but would still come out victorious with minimal casualties. The 14-hour-long battle for Goose Green commenced on the night of May 28th. The battle ended in a decisive British victory, with over 900 Argentinians surrendering. Then, with 5,000 reinforcements arriving from the 5th Infantry Brigade, the British started preparing for their final assault on Stanley. In a series of hard-fought battles, they took control of the hills and mountains surrounding the town, as the Argentine forces withdrew with British ships shelling their positions from offshore. Utterly surrounded, on the 14th of June, the Argentinians surrendered, and the war was over. The 2-month-long war claimed hundreds of lives.
Holy shit, that many for such a fucking tiny-ass island that literally has a worthless I doubt I have anyone here viewing from the Falklands. But the Falklands don't have a good economy. It is not entirely... I guess it's strategically important for the British because unlike... I guess I can see it being argued that it's kind of strategically important for British influence in the region, even though the British don't really partake in world influence anymore. Not like... If for the United States that owned the Falklands, I can certainly see why a war would be freaking fought over it. Because the United States want to maintain influence over many, many places in the world. That's just the truth of the matter. Like, the United States wants to maintain influence so that, one, it can make money, and two, it wants to also maintain that no one can really challenge its authority. Now that's a very kind of cynical view, but it's kind of how things have been shown through the last 50 years of American influence and intervention as the world superpower. But damn, 255 British killed for islands that have no resources. Their economy is pretty much based off of fishing and the sheep that had to be imported there. Like, I mean, I guess I can understand also, like, as a first world kind of outdated term, as an advanced, as a strong economy country, one of the leading nations of the world, and the former world superpower that has now been usurped after the Second World War, you also don't want to I guess, suffer a defeat or a loss of territory to a country that has its economy essentially in shambles. The Argentinians at this time, as that is also under a dictator, as Oversimplified pointed out. But still, 255 people dead for that? Just on the British side? And then the Argentinians suffering 649? With over 2,000 wounded? Combined? It seems so pointless.
And left the islands strewn with minefields that still pose a problem to this day. Argentina still claims the islands, but in 2013 a referendum was held, and the islanders voted 99.8% in favor of remaining British. Plus, oil was just found near the islands, so the British probably aren't going to give them up anytime.
Alright, now they certainly have strategic importance. Well, now they certainly have economical importance. Holy shit.
Soon.
I wonder if anyone knows, please tell me, like, if the oil deposit that has been found near the Falklands is worth, like, is a significant amount. Is it a lot, or is it just like, yeah, it'll last a few years of mining and then it'll run dry. But certainly that'll help the local economy down there, even though it won't be good for the planet. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I have nothing else to add, so I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.